Just a nurse. That's what they called her in the break room when they thought she couldn't hear. Just a night shift nurse who moved through Cedar Creek Medical like she was counting down the minutes until dawn. Dr. Marcus Pierce didn't know she'd held a field hospital together under siege for 11 hours while shrapnel embedded itself in her shoulder. He had no idea that the folded flag hidden in her locker represented something classified so deeply that the Pentagon had erased her from existence. Sarah Chen arrived for her shift at 20:47 hours on a Tuesday, pushing through the emergency department doors as rain hammered the parking lot outside. The antiseptic smell hit first, that sharp chemical bite that never quite washed out of scrubs no matter how many times you ran them through the hospital laundry. Her sneakers were silent on the cold linoleum as she swiped her badge, the magnetic lock clicking open with a soft mechanical voice. The night shift consumed her like a ritual. 12-hour stretches where the hospital transformed from a place of controlled chaos into something quieter, something where the fluorescent lights seemed to hum at a different frequency. The night shift was where she belonged, where there were fewer witnesses, fewer people who asked questions about the small scars on her hands or the way she moved with the terrifying fluid precision of someone trained in trauma under fire. She checked in at the nurse's station on the 4th floor, her chart already waiting. 3 patients in the cardiac step-down unit, 2 in ICU recovery, 1 post-op thoracic case in room 4012. Her hands moved across the printed reports with the efficiency of muscle memory, cataloging vitals and medication schedules in seconds. A junior nurse named Marcus, fresh out of his licensing exam by maybe 6 months, glanced up from his computer. "Hey Sarah, you mind taking the new thoracic admission?" Pierce already ordered 3 tests before the guy even hit the bed. "Seems intense." Sarah nodded once. Her jaw was a straight line. Room 4012, guy stable though. Looks military. She moved toward the supply closet before clocking in officially, something she did every shift. A small locker, number 47, painted a faded blue that had probably been institutional green in 1997. Inside, hanging from a hook inside the door, was a photograph in a plastic sleeve. Her son David, 16 years old, wearing his school uniform and standing beside a man in full green beret dress uniform. Colonel James Morrison. David's commanding officer in the DROTC program. David's father figure since she'd lost his dad at FOB Shank 9 years ago. She touched the frame for exactly 3 seconds. Her hands didn't shake. They never did anymore. Power is not a title. Power is the ability to help. That's what her old CO, Captain Halloway, had told her the night before the operation went dark. Before the ambush. Before everything got classified and sealed and locked away in Pentagon vaults that required 3 separate authorizations even to open. She closed the locker and turned back to the corridor. Room 4012 was a standard post-op setup, monitor beeping its steady rhythm, for running normal saline on a pump, oxygen flowing at 2 liters through nasal cannula. The patient was awake, a man in his 60s with a kind of bone structure that comes from good genetics and 40 years of military discipline. His chart said retired, consulting, but Sarah read the truth in the way his eyes tracked the room's exits. Training never left your body. She checked the monitors first, her movements economical and precise. BP 142/88. Resting heart rate 67. O2 sat at 98%. Sinus rhythm holding steady. "I'm Sarah. I'll be your nurse tonight." Her voice was quiet, professional, the kind of voice that calmed people without seeming to try. "How's your pain level?" 3, maybe 4. The man's voice carried the gravel of someone who'd smoked cigars in mountain operations and never bothered to quit. "They tell me I'm lucky. Appendix rupture caught before sepsis took hold." She adjusted his flow rate by 0.2 milliliters, a tiny correction that would prevent fluid overload without compromising his rehydration. The movement was so small nobody would notice. Nobody except someone trained to notice things. To see the details that meant the difference between a patient living through the night or coding at 3 a.m. She was checking his surgical site, clean, dry, dressing intact, when the elevator dinged down the hall. Dr. Marcus Pierce arrived on the 4th floor the way he arrived everywhere, like he owned the building. His white coat was pristine, his stethoscope draped around his neck in the way of someone who wore it as a crown rather than a tool. He was 62 years old, his silver hair styled with the kind of precision that required a barber appointment every 10 days, his jawline the kind that belonged in medical school fundraiser photographs. He moved toward the nurse's station and Sarah felt the shift in the air, the way the oxygen seemed to compress when his presence entered a room. He pulled up the post-op orders on the tablet without speaking, his eye scanning the documentation with the methodical hunger of a man cataloging every decision made in his absence. A resident was at the station too, a kid named Rodriguez who couldn't have been more than 26, with the nervous energy of someone still terrified of making a mistake. Pierce tapped the screen. Thoracic post-op in 4012. I want a repeat chest X-ray at 0400, CBC with differential before discharge planning, and someone get me the pathology on that appendix tissue. Why are we waiting on this? Rodriguez stammered. We just ordered it an hour ago, Dr. Pierce. The lab is doing their job slowly because nobody's making them rush. That's the problem with modern nursing. His voice carried through the corridor like ice water poured into still glass. Nobody takes initiative anymore. Nobody thinks ahead. They just follow the protocol like robots. Sarah was in room 4012, standing between the patient and the hallway, when she heard him say it. She didn't flinch. She didn't freeze. She simply registered the words and filed them away in the part of her brain that had learned, long ago, to treat insults like intelligence reports. Data. Nothing more. Rodriguez looked like he wanted to apologize for something he hadn't done wrong. Sarah watched this from the doorway and made a decision that would echo across the next 48 hours. She stepped into the corridor. Her hands were steady as stainless steel. The pathology lab is running 3 appendectomy samples, she said quietly. All from this morning. Ours is 3rd in queue. Ordering it again doesn't change the queue time. It wastes the lab's resources and creates duplicate work. Pierce's head came up slowly. His eyes found her like a targeting system locking onto a heat signature. For exactly 2 seconds, neither of them moved. She was violating the unspoken law of hospital hierarchy, the rule that said night shift nurses didn't correct attending physicians in front of residents. The rule that said if you didn't have a white coat, you kept your mouth shut and your head down. I'm sorry, what's your name? Pierce asked. The question itself was violence wrapped in politeness. Sarah Chen. I've been night shift nursing here for 3 years. Sarah Chen, he repeated, tasting the name like something bitter. And you have a degree in lab workflow management? No. I have a degree in nursing from UNC and 9 years of clinical experience. She didn't say the other thing. Didn't say captain. Didn't mention the field hospital or the siege at Bagram or the way you learned to optimize supply chains when you had 4 units of blood left and 12 casualties waiting in a tent under mortar fire. Well, Sarah Chen, Pierce said, his voice dropping into the register he used when he wanted an audience to hear cruelty delivered as logic. I'll appreciate it if you remember that I attended medical school for 4 years after completing my undergraduate degree and residency for another 5. You may have read a lot of protocols, but there's a significant difference between protocol and clinical judgment. He turned back to his tablet without waiting for a response. Rodriguez looked at Sarah like she'd just volunteered to stand in front of a moving vehicle. She didn't move. Her jaw was a single line. Her hands didn't tremble. She simply nodded once, the kind of tiny movement that could mean agreement or acceptance or nothing at all, and turned back to room 4012. But inside her chest, something shifted. She felt it the way you feel a tectonic plate moving beneath the earth, not as a crack, but as a settling. A recognition. A realization that Dr. Pierce had just made a choice that would reshape the entire architecture of this hospital. He decided something in that moment. Sarah could see it in the way his shoulders relaxed after she left, the way he continued speaking to Rodriguez with the absolute certainty of a man who'd just reasserted his dominion over his territory. He'd seen her competence and he'd hated it immediately. Not because she was wrong about the lab Q, she wasn't, but because she was right about it, and she'd been right without asking his permission first. And he was the kind of man for whom that constituted an unforgivable crime. She moved through her patient checks with mechanical precision after that. Room 4011, an 84-year-old woman recovering from hip replacement. Vital stable. Pain controlled on the current medication. Room 4009, a 42-year-old with newly diagnosed atrial fibrillation. Cardiac monitor showing regular sinus rhythm. For running metoprolol on a drip. The tasks grounded her the way they always did. The physical reality of checking blood pressures and adjusting for flow rates and listening to lungs with a stethoscope, that was real. That was something she understood in her bones. Medical crises didn't care about hierarchy. They didn't wait for white coats or seniority. They killed democratically, and the people who survived were the ones who knew how to move under pressure without freezing. Who could make decisions at 3 in the morning when their hands were covered in blood and the monitor was screaming. She was charting in room 4014 when the ICU unit called down. "Sarah, can you come up to 5th? Patient in 5017 is starting to decompensate. We need someone to run point while the resident's in another code." She was moving before the sentence finished. The stairs were faster than the elevator at this hour. She took them 2 at a time, her body remembering the movements of a person who'd run field triage under artillery fire. The ICU on the 5th floor was a different animal, more machines, more alarms, more of that edge that came when people were actively dying. Room 5017 held a man who'd come in 3 days ago with septic shock following a perforated bowel. His O2 sat had dropped to 84%. His breathing was shallow and fast. The junior resident assigned to him, a woman named Keisha, was standing at the bedside looking at the monitor like it might suddenly make sense if she stared at it long enough. Sarah took the vitals in a single glance, the speed of experience, and moved to the 4 station. Rapid sequence intubation. "I've never?" Keisha started, but Sarah was already checking the medications. "We need to move. His SATs are dropping and there's no airway emergency yet, but there will be in about 4 minutes. Size for 0.0 endotracheal tube. Get me 0.25 midazolam and 1 of succinylcholine." She didn't ask. That was the difference between a command and a request. Keisha moved. The respiratory therapist who'd appeared at the sound of oxygen desaturation moved. The nurse assigned to the unit moved. Sarah's hands guided the endotracheal tube through the vocal cords with the kind of spatial precision that came from having done it before under circumstances that made a hospital operating room look like a luxury resort. The tube slid into place. She secured it with tape in for swift movements. She checked position with a stethoscope. Both lungs inflating. Symmetrical. Perfect. The ventilator picked up the rhythm at 14 breaths per minute. O2 sat climbed. 84, 88. 91, 96. Stable. The room went quiet except for the hiss of the ventilator and the steady beeping of the monitor returning to normal sinus rhythm. Sarah stepped back from the bed. Her hands were steady as a surgical laser. Keisha was staring at her like she'd just done something that violated some fundamental law of physics. "How did you?" "Experience," Sarah said quietly. "You did fine. You knew to call for help. That's the part that matters." She moved back down to the 4th floor at 03 for 7 hours, the hospital night deepening around her like a held breath. Dr. Pierce was nowhere visible. That was the smart choice he'd made. The one intelligent decision that would be his last for several weeks. What he didn't know, what nobody at Cedar Creek Medical knew as they moved through their small routines in the darkness, was that he'd just made an enemy of someone who'd spent years learning how to move through war zones without being seen, without being heard, without giving away anything except her hands when lives depended on it. Just a nurse. That was what Dr. Marcus Pierce called her, though not to her face. Not yet. He was still building his case, still gathering ammunition, still moving like a chess player who'd spotted a weakness 3 moves ahead. They didn't know she'd spent 18 months in Bagram watching men twice her size fold under pressure. They didn't know what she'd learned about institutional power structures while standing in a field hospital under mortar fire. All they knew was that Sarah Chen had corrected him, and he would never forgive that. The attending lounge at Cedar Creek Medical smelled like burnt coffee and the particular staleness of a room where powerful men kept their secrets. Morning light cut through the windows at 6:15 a.m., catching dust motes that drifted like snow through the sterile air. Dr. Pierce stood by the coffee station with 4 other attendings, Hayes from cardiology, Mitchell from orthopedics, 2 surgical residents whose names barely registered as permanent fixtures. He was holding a steaming cup, his silver hair catching the light in exactly the way a man of 58 with a $12,000 watch intended. "That Chen woman," he said, voice pitched low but carrying. Not a question. A pronouncement. "Anyone actually verify her credentials?" "I'm asking because something felt off about her intervention last shift. Too confident for a night nurse. Too presumptive about protocol." Mitchell glanced up from his phone. "She's been here 3 years. Solid performance reviews. On paper, maybe." Pierce smiled, the kind of smile that made younger doctors nod automatically. "But I've been trying to reach her references. All Pentagon dead ends. No forward responses. That's unusual, isn't it? For someone who claims military medical background." Hayes shifted his weight. "She's efficient. Efficient doesn't equal qualified." Pierce took a deliberate sip. "I just think we should know who's making clinical decisions in our building. Especially with night shift trauma cases. Especially when they're correcting attending physicians." The room's pressure changed. Not visibly. Subtly. The way air shifts before a thunderstorm, a pressure drop that made the ears register danger without the brain consciously acknowledging it. By that evening, the attending lounge conversation had transformed into something else entirely. Whispers in the hallway. A question from the chief resident, "Has anyone actually seen her nursing license in person?" A comment from the charge nurse, "I wonder where she really trained." By midnight, the story had evolved into a fully formed rumor, the kind that spreads through hospitals with the virulence of influenza. Sarah Chen's credentials were questioned, her background was vague, her confidence was suspicious. Within 72 hours, the social architecture of Cedar Creek Medical had restructured itself around a single fact: Sarah Chen was not to be trusted. She noticed on the 3rd day. Sarah walked into the break room at 02:30 with her thermos and a container of rice and vegetables, and 3 nurses, Melissa, Chen's usual rotation, Jackson from the trauma unit, and Patricia from neuro, exchanged the kind of glance that predators recognize instinctively. The chairs scraped against linoleum as they stood, gathering their things, leaving. Not quickly. Not dramatically. Just leaving. The room went dead silent except for the fluorescent light's mechanical hum, that low-frequency buzz that existed just at the edge of human hearing. Sarah sat down anyway. Her hands moved with absolute precision, opening the container, unwrapping the plastic spoon. Her face remained granite, the kind of composure that came from 18 years of watching people die and continuing to function. But her jaw clenched once, a single muscle contraction that lasted perhaps 1 second, the only tell she permitted herself. She ate alone under the fluorescent lights, mechanically consuming protein and carbohydrates, her eyes fixed on nothing in particular. Pierce made his next move on a Tuesday morning, posting a formal written warning on the unit board where every staff member would see it. The paper was official, letterhead from the hospital administration office, typewritten with the authority of institutional power. Written warning. Employee, Sarah Chen, RN, Cedar Creek Medical Night Shift. Date of incident, date. Violation, insubordination and questionable judgment. Details, unauthorized override of post-operative protocol in ICU patient care, assumption of physician-level clinical authority without proper credentials verification, flagrant disregard for chain-of-command procedures. Recommended action, formal remedial training, supervisory probation pending further investigation. Sarah Chen, read the final line, please sign below to acknowledge receipt. The staff gathered like pilgrims at a shrine. Whispers multiplied, did you see? I heard she's not even a real RN. Mitchell from cardio says his wife's cousin went to nursing school with someone who knew her from somewhere else. The rumors had started developing their own biology now, mutating, adapting, becoming whatever story fit best into the listener's existing prejudices. She was too confident. She didn't belong here. Something wasn't right about her. Sarah walked past the board at 0400 during her rounds through the ICU. 2 night nurses were still standing there, reading. They didn't move when she passed. She signed the acknowledgement without slowing her pace, the pen moving across the paper with the same steadiness her hands possessed during emergency procedures. Someone had expected her to break then, to stumble, to falter, to show the fractures that public humiliation was designed to create. Instead, she continued to ICU room for 12, checked the ventilator settings on a post-op abdominal surgery patient, adjusted and rate, documented her findings. Her hands were instruments of precision. Her face gave nothing. But that wasn't the worst part. On the 4th day, the ambulance arrived at 0317 with lights and sirens that cut through the pre-dawn darkness like screaming. The dispatch radio crackled, trauma alert, Cedar Creek. Male subject, multiple stab wounds to right torso and abdomen, found in parking lot altercation with unknown assailant, vitals en route, ETA for minutes. The trauma bay doors burst open and the stretcher rolled through carrying Colonel James Morrison, Sarah's son David's commanding officer, the man whose voice had spoken through the barracks speaker system on deployment days, the man whose steady hand had guided 300 soldiers through ambushes and IED fields and the particular mathematics of keeping people alive in places where staying alive meant something. His grey-streaked hair was matted with blood. His tactical vest was cut. The white linoleum beneath the stretcher was stained with the particular red that meant arterial rather than venous bleeding. Dr. Pierce arrived moments later, moving with the authority of his position, his voice pitched to dominate the room. Get trauma labs. Type and cross 6 units. Who's the primary? I'm here, Sarah said, stepping forward from where she'd been prepping before station. She was already moving, her hand selecting a 14-gauge angiocath needle with the automaticity of muscle memory developed over thousands of repetitions. For access, establishing now. Captain Chen, Morrison's wife said from somewhere behind the stretcher, the word escaping before she could stop it. She'd been a military spouse long enough to recognize authority when it manifested in motion rather than words. Pierce's head snapped up. His eyes found Sarah, and for exactly 1 second, his institutional advantage wavered. Then he recovered, his voice taking on the particular pitch of a man reasserting dominance. Nurse Chen, are you qualified to handle trauma of this magnitude? Or should someone with actual emergency credentials take over? I've heard concerning things about your background. Concerning things. Or lack thereof. The room's pressure changed again. Slower this time. Heavier. Sarah's voice came out flat, calibrated, professional. For is in, doctor. Vitals are stable. Blood loss appears controlled pending imaging. That wasn't what I asked, Pierce said, but she was already moving, already positioned on the other side of the stretcher, already documenting Morrison's oxygen saturation, already performing the complex mental mathematics that separated a viable patient from a fatality statistic. Her hands moved with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who'd performed field thoracotomies with a combat knife because it was the only instrument available and blood was just another fluid to manage. She did not make eye contact with Pierce. She did not respond to the implication beneath his words. She simply continued, and the trauma team moved around her like water flowing around a stone, because competence has its own gravitational field and Pierce's questions evaporated in the face of her absolute presence. Later, after Morrison was stabilized, after the labs came back clean enough, after the CT imaging showed the blade had missed his lungs by centimeters and his kidneys by what amounted to the mercy of a randomness that nobody controlled, Sarah found herself in the supply closet on the 4th floor. The door was metal. Cold. The shelving held for bags and dressing kits and all the supplies that kept the machinery of healing functioning. She pressed her forehead against one of the shelves, the smooth stainless steel cool against her skin, and allowed herself exactly 30 seconds of trembling. Not crying. Not breaking. Just the involuntary physiological response of muscles that had been clenched for days, finally releasing. 20 seconds in, she heard footsteps in the hallway outside. They passed. She counted the remaining time, her breathing slowing, her hands becoming steady again. At the 30-second mark, she straightened, adjusted her scrubs, checked her reflection in the scratched metal door, and walked back out into the fluorescent-lit corridors of Cedar Creek Medical, where nobody knew that the woman they were beginning to hate had spent 18 months in Bagram running a field hospital under siege conditions with nothing but her hands, her training, and the knowledge that the only alternative to continuing was becoming one of the bodies you were supposed to save. The rumor machine continued its work. Pierce continued his investigation. And Sarah Chen continued her shifts, her hand steady, her face composed, her jaw clenching once per humiliation and then releasing, because some lessons learned under fire taught you that the price of survival was accepting that everyone around you would eventually recognize what you'd become, just not until it was too late to use that knowledge for anything other than regret. Colonel James Morrison arrived at Cedar Creek Medical at 1847 hours on a Monday evening, and the parking lot violence had already written itself across his body in crimson. 2 stab wounds. The first had missed his heart by 2 centimeters. The second had caught the soft tissue beneath his left ribs, a wound that should have killed him in the back of a sedan but hadn't, because Morrison had been trained to survive things that killed ordinary men. Sarah Chen knew this the moment she saw him wheeled through the trauma bay doors, not because anyone had told her, but because she recognized the posture of a person who had absorbed catastrophic pain and continued moving forward anyway. His wife, Eleanor, followed the stretcher with the expression of someone watching a building collapse in slow motion. Dr. Pierce arrived 7 minutes later, his silver hair still damp from whatever dinner he'd abandoned, his chest puffed with the particular satisfaction of a man who had finally been handed relevance by tragedy. He was already in Morrison's room when Sarah approached with the 4-cart, having been assigned to trauma support by virtue of her seniority and the fact that she happened to be on duty when the helicopter call came through. She moved with mechanical efficiency, her hand steady as a surgical laser, already calibrating the angle of approach for Morrison's left basilic vein as she assessed his arm beneath the fluorescent lights. The man had seen combat. His hands told her this. Calluses on the wrong parts of his palms. Muscle memory in movements that civilians didn't possess. Captain Chen, Pierce said, and the emphasis on her rank was deliberate, a reminder that she held a title he did not respect. He was addressing her in front of Eleanor Morrison, who sat rigid in the corner chair, her fingers twisted around a purse strap. I trust you've reviewed the post-operative protocol updates? The ones mandating physician approval before any medication adjustments. His voice carried the particular cruelty of a man asking a question he already knew the answer to, designed specifically to undermine her in front of an audience. He was implying incompetence. He was implying she had not reviewed protocols, that she might make unauthorized changes, that her judgment could not be trusted. Eleanor's eyes flickered toward Sarah, then back to her husband on the stretcher. Sarah did not pause. She did not look up from the 4-cart. She said, "Understood, doctor," and inserted the angiocath needle into Morrison's vein with a single fluid motion, the needle sliding home without resistance, the flashback of blood immediate and clean. Hiss of the line being secured. She pressed the tape down with 2 fingers, her movements economical and absolute. Morrison's blood pressure was dropping. 84/50. She was already calculating transfusion protocols in her head, already anticipating what he would need, already 3 steps ahead of whatever Pierce was performing with his words. The vein did not blow. The line did not infiltrate. By the time Pierce finished speaking, Sarah had already drawn labs, started the first liter of O-negative, and positioned the overhead lights without being asked. Eleanor watched this sequence unfold. Sarah could feel the woman's eyes tracking her hands, the way they moved without hesitation, without the second-guessing that characterizes people who are not certain of what they're doing. For a moment, Eleanor's jaw unclenched slightly. She had seen something in those hands. Some evidence that her husband was going to be cared for by someone who knew how to save lives. But Pierce had already turned away, already moving to examine Morrison's wounds, already plotting the next angle of attack. The surgery went cleanly. Primary closure of the upper wound, exploration of the deeper injury showing no organ perforation, Morrison's green beret conditioning and physical fitness providing the biological advantage that separated survival from exsanguination. Sarah watched from the operating room gallery as Pierce worked, his technique competent and precise, which made him more dangerous, not less. A truly incompetent surgeon would have eventually revealed his inadequacy. Pierce was excellent enough to believe he deserved the authority he claimed, and that conviction made him unstoppable within the hospital's hierarchy. He would not be challenged by performance. He would be challenged only by superior leverage, and he was already thinking 3 moves ahead about where to find it. At 2,130 hours, Pierce made his call. Sarah did not see it happen. She was in the recovery room, monitoring Morrison's emergence from anesthesia, watching his pupils respond to light, assessing the quality of his respirations as the ventilator was being weaned. But she had worked in hospitals long enough to recognize the smell of institutional betrayal. It came back to her in fragments. A conversation she overheard in the nurse's station between the unit secretary and one of the ICU attendings. Something about an investigation. Something about credentials being flagged for external review. Something about a phone call from Dr. Pierce to Richard Sterling, who sat on the hospital's credentialing committee and happened to be Pierce's fraternity brother from Duke Medical School, a detail Sarah had learned not from direct gossip but from the way conversation stopped when she entered a room. The machine made its sounds. Ventilator whooshing in steady rhythm. Monitor beeping with Morrison's sinus rhythm climbing as anesthesia wore off. Saline dripping through the line Sarah had placed 6 hours earlier, the same vein still patent, still functioning, still doing what it had been designed to do. Sarah's hands remained busy. Adjustment of the morphine infusion. Documentation of inputs and outputs. Assessment of the surgical sites for bleeding, for swelling, for any sign of the complications that would justify Pierce's doubts about her competence. There were none. The surgery had been successful. The patient would survive. And somewhere in an office on the hospital's administrative floor, Pierce was speaking in measured tones about credential irregularities and liability concerns and the need for an external investigation before allowing certain nursing personnel to continue in high-acuity roles. Eleanor returned at midnight. She sat in the chair beside Morrison's bed and did not speak to Sarah, not from rudeness but from exhaustion, from the particular hollowness that comes to spouses of military personnel when they are reminded that the dangers their partners face do not end at the border. Sarah had seen this expression before, in the eyes of wives waiting outside surgical tents in Kandahar province, in the faces of mothers watching body bags being loaded onto aircraft at Bagram. She worked silently, letting the monitoring equipment do its work, letting Morrison's body do what it had been trained to do, survive, recover, persist. By 02:30 hours, his blood pressure had stabilized. 98/60. Respiration rate 12. O2 saturation steady at 94% despite the thoracic trauma. He would wake in 6 hours. He would be uncomfortable. He would recover. Sarah was charting in the ICU station at 0430 when she noticed the morning labs. Morrison's white count was creeping up. 15,000. 15,2. The trend was subtle, the kind of thing you only caught if you were looking, if you understood that post-operative fever was not always benign, if you recognized the early cascade of an infection developing in tissue that had just been violated by surgical instruments and knife wounds. She noted the antibiotic schedule. Ceftriaxone. Every 12 hours. Next dose at 0600. But the infection would not wait for the next 12-hour mark. She knew this from field experience, from the weeks she had spent in forward operating bases watching infections establish themselves in the hours between scheduled medications, from the hard education of understanding that protocols written for average cases did not always apply to people who were injured in extraordinary circumstances. At 0515 hours, Sarah walked into Morrison's room ostensibly to check his lines. His wife was asleep in the recliner, her head tilted at an angle that would cause neck pain when she woke. Morrison's eyes were closed, his breathing steady, his body at rest for the first time in 18 hours. Sarah did not wake Eleanor. She moved to the fore pump with the kind of fluid precision that made her movements almost invisible, almost routine, almost impossible to question even if someone had been watching, which they weren't because the shift change was happening and the night nurses were transitioning to day staff and no one was paying attention to the particulars of medication timing. She adjusted the rate of the ceftriaxone infusion from the standard 8 ounce per hour to the faster rate, 5 minutes per hour faster, a modification that would not show on any record, a change that would distribute the antibiotic more aggressively through his system in the hours before his next scheduled dose. The mathematics were simple. The infection would progress. The earlier presence of antibiotics would interrupt that progression. By the time the day nurse reviewed the medication record, the notation would show a routine 12-hour interval. The only evidence that anything had changed would be Morrison's improved white count at the next draw. She finished the adjustment in 43 seconds. Turned. Left the room. Did not look back. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was already pulling into Cedar Creek's parking lot at 01 for 5 hours on the next evening, Marcus Webb's 2003 Ford Explorer moving with the slow deliberation of a man whose mind was not entirely connected to his physical actions, whose thoughts were held prisoner by delusions about military conspiracies and black budget programs and the certain knowledge that Colonel James Morrison represented a threat that could only be neutralized through violence. The loading dock door was unlocked at that hour. The security cameras in that corner of the building had been down for maintenance for 36 hours. Webb knew this because he had worked as a facilities contractor 6 months earlier, before the medications had stopped working, before his grip on reality had fractured into splinters of paranoia and rage. He carried a hunting knife in his jacket. 9-inch blade. Heavy handle. The kind of weapon that belonged to men who understood that some problems could not be solved with words or reason or the systems that were supposed to protect citizens from their own deteriorating minds. The blade was sharp enough to slide through muscle tissue like it was offering no resistance at all. Sharp enough to separate a person from their life in seconds. And Sarah Chen did not know he was coming. She was in Morrison's room at 0150 hours, the hallway beyond the door quiet in that way that late-night hospitals become quiet, all the urgent cases stabilized, all the routine cases sleeping, nothing moving except the nurses making their rounds and the occasional paging system calling someone to somewhere they did not want to go. The hairs on her neck rose. Muscle memory from 17 years of training, from the parts of her brain that had been rewired by deployments and combat and the 1,000 small moments when survival had depended on recognizing threats before those threats announced themselves. She had that feeling. The one that had saved her life in Loga Province. The one that had made her pull a colleague to the ground 3 seconds before an RPG would have passed through the exact space where his head had been. She looked at Morrison. His eyes were closed. Eleanor had gone home. The monitors were maintaining their steady rhythm. And something in the air had changed. Something was wrong. Coming. Inevitable. Sarah turned toward the door. The door burst open at 0200 hours. Not the normal push of a morning delivery, not the controlled swing of a scheduled admission. This was violence announcing itself. Marcus Webb stood in the frame, breathing hard, his eyes the color of burnt matches, his voice a rasp that barely qualified as words. "You sent them after me." His hands trembled around the hunting knife, 8 inches of blade, serrated edge catching the fluorescent light like broken teeth. "The teams. At Bagram. You sent them after me." Colonel Morrison's eyes snapped open. His hand moved toward the call button, but instinct was slower than what came next. Sarah was already moving. Not toward the door. Not toward safety. Toward the space between the blade and the colonel's chest, her body pivoting with a liquid precision of muscle memory activated 1,000 times in muscle memory that had nothing to do with nursing. Her left shoulder took the knife first, a shock of cold that burned, metal punching through soft tissue, through muscle fiber, the resistance of bone as the blade curved and continued its arc deeper. Into her lung. She didn't scream. She didn't cry out. She went down hard, her body hitting the white linoleum with a sound like dropped hospital equipment, her breath coming in a wheeze that tasted like copper and antiseptic. Blood spread beneath her shoulder in a dark bloom, pooling outward in a slow deliberate circle. Her left arm hung useless, nerves and tendons severed, fingers twitching with phantom signals from a brain that was already shutting down non-essential systems. Webb bolted. Footsteps hammered the corridor. Alarms began their rhythmic wail. Sarah's right hand moved. Not conscious. Muscle memory. The same hand that had held pressure on 1,000 chest wounds, that had felt the warm rush of blood under palm and finger, that knew the language of dying bodies spoke only in compression and rhythm. Her fingers found Morrison's chest, his wound, fresh from Webb's first wild slash, bleeding steadily. Pressure. Contact. Compression. 1, 2, 3. Sarah. Morrison's voice was distant, underwater. Sarah, stay with me. Her vision was narrowing. The room became a tunnel. The colonel's face above her was pale, mouth moving, but sound was disconnecting from meaning. Her right hand kept working. Compression. 1, 2, 3. She could feel her lung filling, blood where air should be, her body's oxygen saturation plummeting in real time, the physical sensation of drowning while still breathing. The code team came through the door in formation. Dr. Pierce first, his silver hair catching light, his expression shifting from authority to shock in a single heartbeat. Nurses, respiratory, 2 residents. The choreography of a medical crisis, muscle memory for them too, but different. Theirs was trained. Hers was combat. They stabilized her first. Intubation. The endotracheal tube slid past her vocal cords, sealed her airway, connected her to a ventilator that would breathe for her while her damaged lung failed. Chest tube. The plastic catheter positioned to drain blood from the thoracic cavity, connected to a gravity drain that would measure the size of her injury in milliliters. 2 large bore lines for blood products. Type O negative. Universal donor. The ritual of saving lives when the alternative was the silence that came after. Then Morrison. Dr. Pierce's hands moved with competence that was cold and automatic, the hands of a surgeon who had never doubted his own authority. But his eyes kept sliding to Sarah, to the pool of blood she'd left on the linoleum, to the fact that she'd sacrificed her own survival for a man she'd met 3 days ago. Sarah woke 40 hours later in the ICU, her chest wrapped in surgical tape, her left arm immobilized in a sling, her lung reinflated but damaged, breathing assisted by the ventilator that would take another 2 days to remove. The pain was distant, managed by medication that made the world soft and slow. David was asleep in the chair beside her bed, his face tear-streaked, his high school hoodie torn at the collar. 16 years old and looking at his mother like she was already a ghost. At hour 42, Dr. Pierce entered the room with 2 hospital administrators in dark suits. He didn't sit down. The suits didn't either. Standing made it easier to deliver the message. Ms. Chen, Dr. Pierce began, and his voice had lost its smooth authority. It had become something sharper. Something wounded. Given the investigation into your credentials, which has revealed significant irregularities, and given your reckless endangerment of yourself during the Webb incident, creating massive institutional liability exposure, the hospital has made a decision. Sarah's eyes tracked to his face. The jaw clench was automatic. A millisecond of physical tells before her expression went blank. David started to speak, but Sarah squeezed his hand once. Hard. A command. Your employment is terminated effective immediately. Your badge is to be surrendered at the front desk. You're not authorized to return to this facility. We'll be in touch regarding any outstanding payroll and benefits information. The suits didn't wait for her response. They filed back out, Dr. Pierce trailing them, and Sarah watched the door close with the kind of finality that echoed. David's voice cracked. Mom, that's not, they can't. They can, Sarah said quietly. Her voice was still thick from the endotracheal tube, rough like gravel. And they did. At hour 46, she stood in the hospital laundry room in street clothes borrowed from David, her right arm in a sling now too, both shoulders wrapped in gauze and surgical tape. The blood-stained scrubs from the attack lay in a folded pile on the counter, white fabric turned dark by her own blood, evidence of the moment she'd thrown herself between a knife and a kernel. Folding them was an exercise in muscle memory. Pick up the top. Smooth out the wrinkles. Fold along the seams. Repeat. Her hands moved through the motions while the fluorescent lights hummed their electric prayer, while somewhere for floors above her, Colonel Morrison was eating solid food for the first time since his arrival, unaware that the woman who'd saved his life was being systematically erased. The hospital had won. Dr. Pierce had won. Whatever the investigation turned up or didn't turn up, whatever lies or truths had been constructed, it didn't matter. She was gone. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she'd done it again. Disappeared. Erased. The Pentagon had already taken her records, her service, her identity. Now Cedar Creek had taken her career, her livelihood, her future. She'd spent 3 years building something and destroyed it in a single moment of instinct. The laundry room door opened. A junior nurse, someone Sarah had trained during the third shift orientation months ago, stopped when she saw Sarah. Sympathy flickered across her face, then fear. She didn't speak. She just left. Sarah folded the last scrub and walked toward the exit. At hour 48, Dr. Pierce called a mandatory staff meeting in the main conference room. He wore his authority like a suit, pressed white coat, silver hair perfect, jaw set with the confidence of a man who had just erased a problem. 60 staff members, from residents to attending physicians to nurses from all 3 shifts, packed the room, filling chairs and standing against the walls. In light of recent security concerns, Dr. Pierce announced, his voice steady and commanding, "We're implementing enhanced credentialing protocols. No exceptions. Every employee will be subject to background verification and..." The conference room doors pushed open. David Chen stood in the frame holding a shadow box. Through the glass, military medals caught the light like trapped stars. Sarah Chen stood behind him, her face pale, her jaw a taut line, her body language screaming every form of refusal that her voice couldn't express. "Mom," David said loudly, his 16-year-old voice carrying the weight of something much older, "they need to see these." The room went still. Not quiet. Still. The kind of pause that happens when the universe adjusts itself around a moment. Dr. Pierce's face flushed crimson. "This is a private meeting. Security, I need. Viper 6. The voice came from the back of the room. Colonel Morrison, in a wheelchair because his healing body couldn't manage standing yet, went rigid. He stared at the medals, then at Sarah. His voice was barely a whisper, but in the silence of the room, it carried like a command. "You're Viper 6. A Marine Corps veteran nurse named Jake Torres, standing near the back, pulled out his phone. His fingers moved quickly across the screen, searching, finding. His eyes widened. He turned toward the room and began reading aloud, his voice shaking, "Captain Sarah Chen, Army Medical Corps, Silver Star citation for conspicuous gallantry during siege of Bagram Airfield Field Hospital, where Captain Chen performed 17 life-saving surgeries under sustained enemy fire while personally wounded by shrapnel fragments. Captain Chen maintained command structure of 8 medical personnel and coordinated with tactical air support while managing critical patient loads in a facility under active attack. Her actions resulted in 0 casualty rate among wounded personnel." The room erupted. Gasps. Whispers. "She's a captain. Bagram? That was 11 years ago. That was..." Morrison wheeled forward, his uniform making a sound like starch and determination. Every Green Beret in the JSOC network knows that story. She held that hospital for 11 hours with no backup, no reinforcements, and a shrapnel wound that should have hospitalized her. She performed a field thoracotomy with a combat knife when the power died. "I wasn't there, but I've heard the debrief. That woman," he pointed toward Sarah, who stood motionless, her composure absolute, "is a war hero." Dr. Pierce pushed through the crowd. His voice came out sharp, desperate. "This is hospital business, not some military theater. Those could be fake documents. This woman has been under investigation." The conference room doors opened again. A 3-star general stood in the frame in full dress uniform, blue service dress with ribbons like a constellation of authority. General Patricia Reeves, arriving for a routine visit to a wounded colonel. She saw the shadow box. She saw the medals. She saw Sarah Chen standing in the center of the room, both arms in slings, still bleeding internally, still carrying the wound that this hospital had chosen to punish her for. General Reeves rendered a salute. A full military salute, hand to temple, the kind reserved for the highest honors and the deepest respect. The room went silent. No fluorescent hum. No breathing. No sound at all except the distant beep of monitors in other rooms, other crises, other lives being saved. The fluorescent lights of Cedar Creek Medical hummed their mechanical chorus at exactly 0800 hours on Tuesday morning, 48 hours after the knife came down. Dr. Marcus Pierce stood before his staff in the hospital conference room, his silver hair still perfectly groomed, his tie still precisely knotted, his voice still carrying the weight of authority that had gone unchallenged for 19 years. He was presenting new credentialing protocols, additional background verification, expanded scope reviews, enhanced documentation requirements. His language was clinical, his tone regretful. We must ensure, he was saying, that incidents like the Chen situation do not compromise patient safety again. The staff sat nodding. 3 nurses made notes. A resident stared at his coffee. Nobody challenged him. Nobody questioned why the most decorated trauma physician on the unit was suddenly so concerned about credentials and documentation. Nobody knew that in exactly 4 minutes, everything he had built would begin to collapse like a building after the supports get cut. The lobby doors at Cedar Creek's main entrance opened at 0804. The glass caught morning light and threw it across gleaming tile. A 16-year-old boy in an ROTC uniform walked through carrying a mahogany shadow box. His name was David Chen. His mother's name was Captain Sarah Chen. He was about to end a man's career with his presence alone. David moved through the hospital with the same military bearing his mother carried in her spine. The shadow box was precisely centered against his chest. Inside, under UV protective glass, 3 medals lay on navy velvet arranged in ascending order of prestige. The bronze star with Valor hung first, its bronze cross catching light. Behind it, the silver star, a 5-point star on a blue ribbon, the 3rd highest decoration for Valor. And beside it, 2 purple hearts, the medals awarded for wounds received in service to the country. David did not hesitate at the information desk. He did not ask for permission or directions. He simply walked. Children have a way of knowing where to go when they carry important things. Adults sensed it. A visitor stepped aside. A cafeteria worker looked up from her cart and watched the boy pass. Something in his posture said, "This matters." He entered the staff hallway on the 4th floor just as Dr. Pierce's conference room door was opening. The staff began filing out. Coffee cups in hand. Conversations already turning to rounds and patient lists and the endless machinery of hospital work. David stepped forward into the foot traffic, his voice cutting through the ambient noise with the clarity of someone who had learned to project authority from watching his mother breathe through every humiliation. "Mom, they need to see these." The hallway went still. Not quiet. Still. There is a difference. Quiet is the absence of noise. Still is the absence of movement, the absence of breath, the moment when an entire organism stops processing and just becomes witness. Dr. Pierce was the last one out the conference room door. He saw the boy. He saw the shadow box. His jaw tightened, a microscopic movement, almost imperceptible to anyone who wasn't trained to read physical tells. Almost. Colonel James Morrison appeared in his wheelchair at that exact moment, summoned by something that moved faster than sound through the hospital's nervous system. He had been recovering on the 3rd floor, his stab wound healing under Sarah's modified protocol, his life saved by a woman Dr. Pierce had publicly humiliated. Morrison wheeled forward with his left arm still in a sling, but his right hand moved to grip the armrest as he approached David. His voice dropped to something barely audible, something meant only for the boy and anyone close enough to hear a whisper, "Viper 6." It was Sarah's call sign. The one she had earned at Bagram airfield on a day when everything went wrong and one woman in a field hospital decided that if she was going to die, she would die standing. Viper 6. The operational name. The classified designation. The identity that had been sealed in Pentagon vaults for 7 years. A Marine veteran standing near the lobby entrance heard the call sign. He pulled his phone from his pocket with the muscle memory of someone accustomed to instant digital research. His fingers moved across the screen. The declassified citation came up, a document released just hours ago, the national security protocols lifted at Department of Defense discretion. His voice carried across the hallway as he read aloud, Captain Sarah Chen. Bagram airfield attack. November 2016. Field hospital call sign Viper 6. Held the perimeter under active fire for 11 hours. Performed 17 field procedures including emergency thoracotomy with limited surgical supplies. Multiple casualties stabilized. 0 preventable deaths. Severely wounded but remained operational until medical evacuation. Exemplary service under extreme duress. Dr. Pierce's face had gone the color of old parchment. The elevator doors opened. A 3-star general in dress blues walked out, General Patricia Halloway, commander of Joint Special Operations Command, in Raleigh to visit one of her field commanders. She saw the shadow box in David's hands. She saw the medals through the glass. She stopped mid-step, a uniform catching the overhead lights like burnished steel. Her right hand came up. Sharp. Precise. A full military salute rendered to a shadow box containing the medals of a woman who had given everything to protect people she would never meet. The salute held for 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds, Dr. Pierce understood that his narrative was about to be rewritten by people with authority that made hospital hierarchy look like a child's game. 2 Pentagon officers appeared in the lobby within 47 minutes, representatives from the Army Personnel Security Division, carrying sealed documents that confirmed Captain Sarah Chen's classified service record, her exemplary performance evaluation, and the lifting of national security protocols that had kept her identity hidden for 7 years. Their presence alone was a statement. Their presence in his hospital said, "We know what you did. We know who she is. We know who you are." By noon, the CEO of Cedar Creek Medical had discovered the video. A visitor to Morrison's room had filmed the moment 48 hours earlier when Dr. Pierce stood over Sarah's shoulder as she worked, his voice sharp as a scalpel, his words designed to cut, "Are you genuinely qualified to handle trauma of this magnitude?" The footage showed Sarah's face, completely composed, completely professional, while Pierce tore into her credentials in front of Colonel Morrison's wife. The video had gone viral. For million views by midnight. The comment section became a cascade of outrage, his screaming at a Silver Star recipient. She saved the patient and he humiliated her. Where is this hospital's leadership? Dr. Eleanor Vance saw the video at 11:47 p.m. on her home computer. She was the chair of surgery at Duke University, Pierce's medical school mentor, the architect of the academic surgery program that had trained him 30 years ago. She watched her protégé berate a wounded Army officer who had just saved a patient's life. She watched Sarah's composure. She watched Pierce's arrogance. She picked up her phone. She did not wait until morning. She did not send an email. She called the Cedar Creek CEO directly. "If Marcus Pierce remains on your staff," Dr. Vance said, her voice carrying the weight of institutional power and personal disappointment, "I will ensure that Cedar Creek Medical never receives another Duke resident. Not one. Ever again. That is not a threat. That is institutional certainty." The Cedar Creek board convened at 0600 Wednesday morning. They reviewed the timeline that Pierce's own campaign had created, the rumors in the attending lounge, the formal write-up posted on the unit board, the investigation he had initiated while Sarah Chen was in the ICU having been stabbed. They discovered that Pierce had restricted her patient access the day before the attack, preventing her from properly monitoring Colonel Morrison's antibiotics and wound care. They discovered that Sarah had worked around his restrictions anyway, adjusting orders that were technically beyond her current scope because she understood, with certainty born of 7 years handling crisis medicine, that infection was coming and nobody was going to stop it. They discovered that Sarah had done this knowing it could end her career. They discovered that she did it anyway. The CEO presented Dr. Pierce with his options at 0730. Resign or be terminated with cause. Pierce tried to salvage something. His voice had lost its authority, replaced by the desperate tone of a man watching his identity evaporate. She didn't have proper credentials. I was protecting patients. I was protecting the institution. But the Pentagon letter confirming Captain Chen's exemplary record was already public. And Dr. Vance's condemnation had already spread through academic medicine like wildfire. And no hospital would hire a surgeon whose own mentor had declared him unfit. And his professional network, the fraternity brothers, the golf club friends, the colleagues he had cultivated through 2 decades of careful relationship management, had gone absolutely silent. The phone stopped ringing. The emails dried up. The invitations to speaking engagements were cancelled. The requests for consulting contracts disappeared. By Friday, Pierce's name had been quietly removed from the Cedar Creek Medical website. 6 months later, someone spotted him teaching CPR fundamentals at Raleigh Community College. His silver hair had gone mostly grey, as if time was accelerating. His hands trembled as he demonstrated chest compressions on a plastic dummy to a class of bored students who didn't know they were learning from someone who had once commanded operating rooms full of residents and nurses who hung on his every word. $18 an hour. That was what his expertise was worth now. That was the market rate for a surgeon who had weaponized his authority against a woman with medals in her closet. The Pentagon ceremony took place 74 days later, the delay caused by paperwork that had to move through agencies and protocols and bureaucratic channels. Sarah Chen stood in her army dress blues, the uniform fitting perfectly, her silver star and bronze star pinned above her left chest pocket. Her purple hearts hung beside them. Her son David stood beside her in his best suit, still in Rotk, still learning to carry weight with purpose. The Secretary of Defense presented her with a commendation for valor in the Cedar Creek incident. She had saved Colonel Morrison's life twice, once through medicine and once through physical intervention. She had done this at the cost of a knife wound through her shoulder, a lung trauma that required 4 units of blood and a video-assisted thoracoscopy, and 48 hours of uncertainty about whether she would ever return to clinical work. The folded flag from Staff Sergeant Maria Ramos, her fallen teammate from the Bagram Field Hospital, now rested on Sarah's mantle at home. It had spent 7 years in a storage unit footlocker, hidden like everything else. Now it was displayed. Now it was honored. Now the world knew that Maria Ramos had died holding the perimeter so that Sarah could save lives inside. The flag caught morning light through the living room window. Sarah's hands, those steady, unshakable hands, trembled just slightly as she looked at it. Cedar Creek Medical offered her the position of Clinical Director of Emergency Services. The offer came with a formal apology, printed on official hospital letterhead, signed by the CEO and the Board of Trustees. Sarah accepted the position on one condition, that the hospital establish a scholarship fund for military veterans pursuing nursing degrees, named for Staff Sergeant Maria Ramos. The hospital agreed without negotiation. They would have agreed to almost anything. The hospital reopening ceremony took place on a Thursday in early spring, the windows open, the smell of rain hanging in the air. Sarah addressed the staff in the newly renovated emergency department. Her voice carried the tone of someone speaking from hard-earned clarity. "Power is not a title," she said. "Power is the ability to help." Colonel Morrison sat in the front row, fully recovered, his dress uniform crisp, his posture perfect. He rendered a salute when she finished. The entire staff rose in standing ovation. David stood beside his mother, tears streaming down his face, finally understanding why she had kept so many secrets. Why she had carried invisible weight. Why she had never let anyone see her shake. In the back of the room, Jake Torres, the respiratory therapist who had witnessed her competence long before anyone else understood her, started the applause. His hands came together in rhythm. Others joined. The sound built until it became something like recognition. Something like forgiveness. Something like the acknowledgement that heroes sometimes walk among you disguised as ordinary people. Sarah's face remained composed during the ovation, but her hands moved to her sides, and anyone watching closely could see them, those remarkable, steady hands, tremor with the memory of 30 seconds in a supply closet, with the knowledge of what she had survived, with the weight of being finally, fully seen. Later, in the new emergency department, Sarah mentored a young veteran nurse named Marcus, a former Army medic struggling with untreated PTSD, his confidence fractured, his hands sometimes shaking during procedures. She taught him the breathing technique that had carried her through those 30 seconds. She taught him how to convert fear into precision. She taught him that visibility was not weakness. "You don't have to be invisible anymore," Sarah told him, her hand steady on his shoulder. "None of us do." Marcus looked at her, really looked at her, and understood that he was being taught not just how to breathe, but how to live. How to honor the weight you carry. How to let people see you, finally, as you actually were. The hospital lights hummed their endless mechanical song, as they always did. But inside those walls, everything had changed. The quiet night shift nurse had become the woman who would define that hospital's future. The woman everyone had dismissed had become the woman everyone would follow. The story wasn't over. Stories like this never end. They just transform into something larger, a legend that gets told at shift change, a standard of care that gets better because one woman refused to be broken, and a reminder that power isn't something you take from a title or a position. It's something you claim by standing absolutely still while the world tries to destroy you, and then standing back up when your turn comes to heal. If you haven't already, subscribe to this channel for more stories of quiet heroes and public reckoning. Like this video if you believe the truth eventually finds its way to light. And comment below, would you have protected Colonel Morrison the way Sarah did, knowing it would cost you everything?